My name is Wendell Wallach, and I'm a consultant, lecturer, and scholar at Yale University's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics. At the center, I oversee the Technology and Ethics Study Group, and my focus of research is upon the ethical, legal, and public policy challenges posed by new and emerging technologies, which includes robotics and intelligent systems. I'm also a co-author of a book with Colin Allen titled Moral Machines Teaching Robots Right from Wrong.
What is your current work about?
Well, my current work has been looking most explicitly at implementing moral sensitivities within computer systems, meaning both within the decisions the computer systems make, but also in the systems, the socio-technical systems that include the computers and both the people who work with them. But I think what you're really referring to is considerations about robotic weaponry.
Right.
And what are the ethical and legal concerns that come up in the use of robotic weaponry in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and the CIA has actually been using such weaponry in other countries. And as I understand it, NATO has now committed itself to this weaponry, though it may take a few years before it actually receives the delivery of the drones.
Right. Actually, NATO took the decision that they run within their smart defense program. That's the way they call it. These new weaponry, but it won't be delivered, I guess, until 2020. So, what you're doing right now for the U.S. might be something like a role model. How other countries are going to deal with these new weaponaries, with the human aspects of it, with the ethical aspects, society aspects of this entire new field. I mean, it does make a difference if a pilot is flying, and he sees this target is not the enemy, it's a hospital. He could decide, I'm not going to throw down this bomb. But if it's an unnamed vehicle flying over there, they may just push the button, and drop the bomb. So,
well, there may be some misunderstanding of what we have today, what we're putting in place, and what the history of this conversation is. So maybe I can give us a little bit more structure in terms of how we think about it.
Please.
So first of all, the U.S. did discover that drones were a very effective means of finding and really taking out targets in locations that they could not really even get soldiers to, either for political, logistical reasons or because the locations were just so remote. So they started buying considerable numbers of drones and deployed thousands of them. In fact, thousands had been ordered before people sat down and really thought about what the ethical and long-term ramifications of moving into this form of technology would be. But the drones did turn out to be so effective in reducing manpower costs, in increasing capabilities, and in decreasing the loss of manpower during hostilities that it isn't exactly the only game in town, but it has become perhaps the most important form of military logistics in Pakistan. Simultaneously with the deployment of this robotic weaponry, the community outside of the military in particular became very uncomfortable because it conjured up the science fiction visions of Terminators and the Matrix and so many other fantasies that eventually we will have robotic systems that will track down and eliminate human beings. And therefore, groups like the International Robotic Arms Control Committee came into being to try and move forward a dialogue on limitations that should be instituted in the application of this kind of weaponry. Now, more recently, the military as they have begun to, the U.S. military, as they begun to think through these issues, realizes that while they aren't so concerned about the science fiction scenarios because they don't know whether they will occur or certainly won't occur given the kinds of capabilities we have now, they have become more sensitized to the possibility that some degree of autonomy could be instituted in weapon systems that would put them beyond direct supervision, would put them on their beyond their direct control. And therefore now they are open to consider ways of setting parameters as to what kinds of autonomous or robotic weapon systems are acceptable.
So if you could be a little bit more precise, what are the very specific points you are pointing out to them, what they should at least consider in finding guidelines in dealing with these new weaponaries?
Well, the most difficult point that we're trying to consider is what kinds of weaponry should be restricted? What kinds of weapons are really unacceptable given the laws of warfare, international humanitarian law? And how would you be clear about those weapons that you would not develop or deploy and those weapons that you consider strategically and tactically acceptable? And here's where you get into some little tricky language, and that's a lot of what's trying to be worked through at this time. So when you think about autonomy in weapons, well, there have been autonomous weapons, for decades, if not longer. Landmines are autonomous weapons. Cruise missiles are autonomous weapons. Over the last 30 years, we have not been able to get any international regime restricting the vast proliferation of cruise missiles we have. So part of what we're trying to get into is what kinds of weapons are we discussing, and how would you describe those weapons that should be restricted from those weapons that are acceptable? Secondly, in all this, it's very important to discriminate between what people speculate drones are doing and what drones are actually doing. Are they, for example, failing, or are they taking out are they engaged in much collateral damage, the loss of human life, really? This very weird phrase we have developed for discussing the loss of human life, or is that limited? One of the reasons the military likes drones is because they feel they can do some very precise targeting, and in many ways the targeting is much more precise than launching a missile would be. So for example, these drones all have very sophisticated cameras and other sensors on them. They are broadcasting this information back to command, where actual reflective decisions are being taken as to whether to strike a target or not strike a target.
Yeah.
So from their perspective, they're actually limiting collateral damage, and they're actually having the opportunity to bring in proportionality to really reflect upon whether the target they might take out is worth any collateral damage that might happen in going after that high value target.
What I'm always wondering in the context of NATO puts these drones, these UAVs, under the expression smart defense. Maybe you can have a take on this.
Well, the smart defense is partially, probably falls into two areas. One is the surveillance of troop movements by our opponents. So, for example, perhaps more drones over the DMZ between North and South Korea might give us early alerts of whether there were massive troop movements across the DMZ from the north to the south. And you can see that in, that is obviously a concern for NATO in terms of the gathering of troops and the movement of troops. So you always have this surveillance component. But the other thing that comes up in terms of defensive components is whether some of these systems could be mounted with anti-ballistic weaponry. So lasers, or they could be used to alert ground missiles, such as Patriot missiles, when to take off, or perhaps gathering information for helping targeting these ground-based anti-ballistic missiles. So that's part of the whole defensive purpose. And the question always is, when is defense masking offense?
Right.
And that's always the difficulty when you, for example, look at restraint on the deployment of arms, whether or not those restraints allow for defensive applications, which really open the door for all kinds of offensive applications in the name of their being defensive.
What I understood yesterday is that part of your current job is somehow to define guidelines how to handle these new kind of weaponaries. What are the major points within these guidelines which you would point out to say these are these are really very, very important things? A country like the US, being the most powerful in the world, which they really need to take care of. And how far, if you as a consultant propose them, what are the tough arguments you have to face, in the discussion to really get this done?
Well, let's first outline what the issues are, and then I'll talk a little bit about the one I'm focusing on most at the moment and what I think can be done, and also some of the tricky parts of how we do it. So I think there are four main issues in the development of increasingly autonomous weaponry. And those are, does increasingly autonomous weaponry lower the barriers to starting new wars? So going back to Athens and Pericles' famous speech to the Athenian people that you're going into this war perhaps a little too easily, and what happens if it doesn't go the way you want it to go? So that is a concern with robotic weaponry, because since it decreases the loss of manpower, then will countries be more willing to use weaponry and start hostilities than they would in the absence of these systems? That's a major concern, but it's a very difficult concern to address. The second one, which we touched upon a little bit, was the use of drones for surveillance activity unrelated to achieving clear military objectives. And that's not just a military issue now. Surveillance drones will be available in airspace all over Europe, America, the rest of the world very soon. And the question is whether any of us will have any privacy anymore, let alone that this will be a nightmare to manage for the aviation administrations in the US and in Europe. The third issue it has to do with the development and proliferation cycle. So America has deep pockets and it spends billions of dollars developing new technologies. But as I've often said, robotics are Lego sets. Once you develop the technology, it's pretty easy for somebody else to assemble that. So they can backwardly engineer our systems, or the basic research has been done on what's feasible and what's not feasible, and it becomes, the barriers to entry for other countries become very low. So though the U.S. has a clear-cut strategic advantage at the moment in military robotics, there appear to be at least 40 other countries at this stage who also have drone programs.
40?
40, somewhere in the 40s is a number I've heard recently. I have heard numbers as high as 63, but I've never seen a formal list that has counted that many countries. And 40 may also be inaccurate or be fudging the numbers. I'm still trying to track down what the empirical data on that is. But as one military leader said to me last week, he said, well, it may be much more than 40 because you're counting, you're looking at governments that are developing these weapons, but you have no idea what private corporations are working on. So there may be other countries working on various kind of robotic weaponry in the hope that they can sell them to the defense establishment. So that's a third issue. The fourth issue, and the one that gets the most passion behind it, is the increasing autonomy of systems that may be capable of initiating lethal force. Now, such systems could be built today, but for a variety of reasons, they are not being built, and yet they're largely not being built by countries that are, like the US, that's trying to honor the laws of war, international humanitarian war to the best of their ability. Autonomous systems initiating lethal force is a concern, perhaps largely because of science fiction or speculation that we will have very sophisticated systems capable of doing this in the relatively near future. I'm skeptical about those conjectures, but I do think there are near-term reasons why we should also be concerned with this. And let me just... And those near-term reasons are not just coming from the critics outside of the military, but they're coming from within the military establishment itself. So one near-term concern is that robots are being built in a way where they not only have increasing autonomy, but those who design and program them can't always predict what they will do in a new situation. The other concern is the coordination between the human and the mechanical elements of what's sometimes referred to as a joint cognitive system. They're working together. And if the humans misunderstand what the action being taken by the semi-autonomous system or system with low intelligence is doing, they may fail to coordinate properly with unintended consequences. And those unintended consequences could be anything from initiating hostilities to the loss of human life. So what the military, I think, is understanding is regardless of whether they are committed to autonomous weaponry, or let's say the science fiction scenarios also scare them a little bit because they are very concerned with control, and they therefore are also very concerned that they do not deploy weaponry that can either malfunction or function properly in a way that undermines their ability to control its actions and the consequences of their actions. So a simple way of putting that is you happen to be recording me in the week when 2 Qurans got burned, perhaps unintentionally. But that has given rise to tremendous turmoil and tremendous costs, both in terms of human life and financially in terms of quelling this occurrence. Well, you don't want a robot unintentionally wiping out, a stack of Qurans.
So my very last question, Wendell, would be, if you would have to point out, let's say, 3 very important points for NATO to consider if they start this program, and there is no doubt they will start this smart defense program with all these drones. What should they really take into consideration using these new kind of weaponaries?
Well, I think it's not enough to implement this weaponry just based on the military advantages it provides. There's a need for deep reflection on the ethical and legal ramifications of going down this road. My concern is really that the long-term consequences could far outweigh the short-term strategic benefits. And in particular, I think there is a need to connect the development of robotic weaponry to the laws of war in a way where there is a clear-cut line for what kinds of systems are acceptable and what kinds of systems are not acceptable. And what is clearly not acceptable is systems that are able to either pick their own targets or initiate lethal activity without direct human intervention, a human in the loop taking responsibility for the actions of the autonomous systems or even semi-autonomous systems. And that principle should not be compromised in any way, shape, or form. That principle should be raised to a new declaration of what is and is not acceptable in this age of smart defense, smart offense.
If the US, and that's actually the way which is most likely to be happen, if the US will be the first country in the world to set up some kind of guidelines for using these robotic weaponaries, what kind of role model do you think they will play also for NATO? I mean, the US is dominant within NATO. What kind of spaces will be left for NATO if something would go wrong with these guidelines the US is preparing?
Well, whether the U.S. is or is not preparing guidelines, that's hopefully we are in a moment when that's possible. I think in the development of any technology, there are critical points where appropriate safeguards can be put in place. So just consider the development of computer systems, computer networks. We missed those crucial points, and now we are beset with a universe of total insecurity in computer networks that on one extreme opens us all up to viruses, and on the other extreme opens us to the prospect of cyber warfare. So it may be that we are at one of those inflection points in the development of military robots, and one would hope that the U.S. would at least set a clear guideline that NATO could build upon in terms of restraining what kinds of systems it is appropriate to develop and deploy and which it is not develop and deploy. And I think that would have tremendous political clout if we actually do that, and tremendous diplomatic cachet, because we do have the strategic advantage at this moment in the development of robotic weaponry. And if we, in this area, as we have not been willing to do in many other areas, say that we are willing to limit that strategic advantage for the betterment of humanity, then that should carry significant weight. But that would only be setting some principles in place. They would still have to be developed for their application in other countries, and it would still be a worldwide concern whether everyone signed on to the same principles. If they don't, then you have some state or non-state actor quite willing to to deploy autonomous weaponry that can target and initiate killing actions without any direct human involvement.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for this conversation, Wendell. I hope it, gets a discussion going on our new platform, We NATO. And hopefully we can follow up soon with some feedback and maybe have a conversation with some of the NATO senior staff on this topic. I really appreciate your thoughts and insights. Thanks a lot.
And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share these.
Yeah.